In this episode, I'm going to cover my tilt wheel steering column, as well as all the modifications I needed to do to my exhaust manifold to get it to fit around the steering linkage. Stay tuned. Okay, so before I dive into things on this episode, I just want to kind of do a recap on this build. So a couple people that have been following along asked a couple questions. One of those is, what did I do with the Ranger engine? So, after I prepped and got the Ranger engine transmission all ready to go, I decided not to go that route. And so I just put it on Craigslist. I think I got like $400 or $500 for the combo with the key and the main computer. I don't know. I definitely didn't make money, but it was nice to have a little extra cash for that. Also, for my fuel system, people were wondering why I had to run a return line from the regulator back to the tank. The magic number for the beams to run properly is 62 psi of pressure at the fuel rail. Now, there's different ways to accomplish this. The way the factory does it is it cycles the pump on and off, controlled by the ECU. I haven't heard of anyone doing this method with a swap before. I suppose it's possible if you had the right wiring diagram, fuel pump, etc. But it's a lot easier to get a generic pump that moves enough volume for your specific engine and use a pressure regulator to set your desired pressure. The way a regulator works is there's a spring diaphragm that you adjust the setting on so that the spring is higher for higher pressure and lower for lower pressure. And then once it reaches that pressure, all of the excess fuel will be able to escape by exiting through the spring-controlled pressure valve in the regulator. So now if you think about what would happen if you took the return out of the system, the pressure valve would still open whenever the regulator saw the desired pressure, but since there's no return, there's nowhere for the excess pressure to go, so the rail would see the total pressure of the system. There is actually a third option a lot of people do with this swap and LS swaps. A certain year Corvette has a regulator built into the fuel filter. So your fuel pump draws fuel out of your tank into your filter, then it has a return side to relieve excess pressure back to the tank, and on the outlet side you get regulated pressure to your fuel rail. That's a pretty cool setup because you can put this filter by your fuel tank and then only have to run one line all the way to your rail. Now, I'm not exactly sure how this works exactly, but I'm assuming that it works very similar to the pressure regulator with a spring that's set to a certain pressure. And that's sort of the downside of this method is I think these are set to 59 psi, which might work great for a Corvette. People have had success running this setup with the beams as well, but it may not work for your engine. I think that's a pretty good recap for now. If you're new to the channel and you want to check out more of the build, the links for the other videos are in the description, and you can also check out the playlist. But right now, let's get into the steering column. Because of a combination of factors, I decided I wanted to get a new steering column for the Starlet. For starters, I used the controls for the blinkers, the windshield wipers, stuff that was attached to the column on the Starlet, and I put that in the Ranger. When I tried to remove the ignition switch from the Starlet to put it in the Ranger, I ended up breaking the casting in the steering column. This made it so even if I would have gotten a new key cylinder, the lock function still wouldn't work, so your steering wheel wouldn't lock when your key's off, which I thought was a safety feature, but actually it turns out to be a theft deterrent. The theory being you could hotwire a car, but without the key, the steering wheel would still be locked, so you can't turn it, which is how a lot of dirt bikes are. Also, when I was doing research on this, I found out that some modern cars aren't actually required to have steering locks anymore. So I think 1969 was when it was kind of mandated in the United States. Recently, some manufacturers have kind of come up with a workaround, apparently. The article I was reading was saying that Miatas after 2009 didn't have steering wheel locks. That might have some implications on towing applications. Definitely something interesting to note that might affect you. Getting back to reasons why I needed a new steering column is I damaged the original mechanism that connects the steering wheel horn to the wiring for the horn. The Starlet, like most early cars, had kind of a round disc with contacts and springs, very similar to brushes on electric brush style motors. This is just a way to have kind of a sliding contact so your steering wheel can turn, but you still have a complete circuit with your horn. But the newer cars have something called a clock spring, which has a bunch of different connections as opposed to just a horn button on an older car. It's a similar setup, but it's actually kind of like a plastic housing assembly that you just kind of, like it's an all-in-one type piece. So all of those factors, as well as I thought if I could find a tilt wheel, it'd be cool to add it in there. So that's sort of the backstory, but I've ran into a lot of issues that I kind of didn't expect or anticipate, and think I learned a lot, so hopefully you guys do too. So this is actually the second column I ended up getting, because first I got a column from a 2007 Toyota Matrix, and I didn't take enough of the bracket for it to rotate on. So I went back and I got this from a 2006 Toyota Corolla, which is pretty much the same setup. First, I'll just walk you through how this column's tilt setup works. This right here is directly to your steering rack, which doesn't move. So this is a rigid connection. And this, even though it's hinged actually from here and then rotates up from this bracket before. This is really what I needed. I cut out this whole area. This was like kind of the structure of the dash of the car. And so basically I'm going to cut out most of this. I don't need this part. I just need this bracket here that pivots off this point and uses this kind of as a slide. So right here you can see there's like this lever, and now we can rotate as it goes like that. And so it's not much of a tilt wheel, but we actually are going to add a little bit of length to the steering because of our aftermarket steering wheel. So it will be a little bit more movement than this. I think looking back on this whole kind of experiment with swapping steering columns is that it would have been good to use, I know at least like a Ford F-150 or Bronco has a steering or a tilt wheel that it seems at least like it's tilting not the whole rack. Like this is tilting from here to here, or I guess from here to here, because this is our pivot point. But I think that their rack pivots closer to up here, so that it's kind of like rigidly mounted. I don't know. It's tricky to say how it works because I haven't taken one apart. But it looks like that might be a better candidate for something like this, but this will still give us some tilt. It's an interesting kind of just to know how it works. Later Toyotas actually had like a telescoping steering column. One of the reasons why I went with this one is because it's from a small car. The Corollas and the Matrix are small cars of small interiors, similar to mine. So it's got that going for it. This really is pretty light, small setup, and also it has a light control on like blinkers and lights on the steering rack, which are the steering column controls, which I wanted that for the system, and I know that the steering wheel lock, all that stuff works. And I've taken one apart before because I had to get the other racks, or the other column. So on the Starlet, there's like a rigid rack, and then it has a U-joint after it. Like this setup is basically already on the car. So I'm going to take this off, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip this around and make this a rigid connection to this right here. Cut this guy off, or I don't have to cut it off, I can just unbolt it. But that way, if my steering column ever fails or something like that, I could just go get another one, and it will just slide back into this guy, which is going to be flipped around. Sounds kind of complicated, but it'll make more sense when I show you what I'm talking about. So I'm going to get to work on this, and you guys can watch along. I put the dash back in because I have to make sure that the steering's going to fit, the heater's going to fit. I need to figure out where my fuses are going to go. But I realized now that I moved my firewall back, even though I remounted the, the bracket for the steering, it doesn't clear here. I got my dash kind of installed in place where it needs to be. Over here we're hitting on this main bracket. So I'm going to go ahead and cut just behind there, and then we're going to fabricate a new bracket because I had the tilt wheel from the Toyota Matrix anyways. So really not adding that much work, but sort of adding a lot of work. So part of removing the steering column is you have to unbolt the steering shaft couplings. When you loosen the bolts a little bit, it'll seem like the shaft coupling is separated, but you actually have to remove the bolt all the way because there's a recess in the shaft that prevents it from coming out unless that bolt is completely removed. After I clearanced my column bracket, I was able to test fit my new column in to see how it was going to fit. So that initial mock-up was with the 2007 Toyota Matrix steering column, and here I'll show you kind of the first issue I ran into. It kind of relates to how I described the tilt wheel at the beginning. The way I was planning on running this was just have this tube right here be rigid, and this would go up and down, which I think for the most part would work, but the problem is when you attach this point right here, this part needs to move. It can't just be rigid, otherwise the wheel is just mounted. If I just welded this to a rigid part, my tilt wheel is not going to tilt. At this point, I basically just had to set the column aside and work on something else for a while, but let's fast forward to when I got that new steering column. Should have wanted it. Yeah, so that guy pulls right out. This guy should pull off. Then what I'm going to do is use this guy. Oh, I was hoping these splines lined up. Since I wanted to flip around one of the shafts, the splines didn't quite line up, so I had to manually file down an area that didn't have a spline to get everything to fit how I wanted. Ah, that worked. Cool. Now's a pretty good time to stress that steering is a huge safety issue, whether it's brakes or steering. If you lose one of those at 70 miles an hour, you're going to have a bad time. So know that this is just my experience. I'm not telling you to do this, but I am showing you the process that I used. Here I decided to make a safety washer by grinding the flat on the washer, and that flat will interface with the flat on the shaft coupling. Okay, so that's not coming out of there. Next I tightened up the coupling to make sure that the washer doesn't prevent that joint from getting fully tight. The washer is still loose in there, so that's good, but there's no way it can come out because of this little step here. Now the next step is to just go ahead and cut everything away that we don't need. Just this bracket right here, this was going to get tack welded to the Starlet, and we'll see how it looks. Alright, so as you can see, I've got my steering column kind of marked up here. And I've got two jack stands holding it up. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get it in a position so I can tack it and kind of plan out my plan of attack here. I can faintly see the center line I'm aiming for right there. I still actually can't get the dash in all the way. So my steering column and the bracket for the column were actually still hitting the dash. So I marked a couple places and removed the dash so I could cut out those areas. One of the things that was interfering with my dash was the bracket for the spring return on the clutch and the brake pedals. So I had to grind that off and make a new bracket that was a little bit lower profile. I had to fine tune one of the return spring locations, but after that my pedals were good to go. Turns out I needed a bit more trimming. Alright, so now that I got this thing welded up, I'm going to put the dash back in to check the clearance and put the seat in to kind of check my fitment. This is kind of one of the fun parts. You can't really know if your steering wheel position is correct unless you have your seat in and the relationship with the pedals, so I went ahead and reinstalled the seat. When you're doing mock-up, it's best to use all the parts you're actually going to be using in the end. I went ahead and used this cheap pulley wheel puller, and it actually worked really well. When I removed the wheel on the other steering column assembly, I totally bent the wheel, so this worked out a lot better. Here I'm installing a wheel adapter, which adapts the factory Toyota steering wheel spline to a universal 6-bolt wheel pattern. Next up, I have the quick release adapter that's already attached to my steering wheel. If you're curious about that and how the horn fits into that assembly, I got an upcoming video that's gonna go a little bit more in depth into that. Alright, I need to tighten down the main nut, but that's actually a pretty good position right there. Okay, so lots of decisions have been made. This whole thing needs to be raised up. I'm gonna need to clearance this. I'm gonna need to make some reinforcements to the dash, so I don't want to break this dash. So this goes up, this gets trimmed. Alright, so this right here is the area I need to clearance. I'm gonna cut it like as far back as I can, like to this point right here. Before I do that, I'm going to take this whole metal structure off and weld in kind of a bracket that ties everything back together so that we have structure to this dash. I do not want to mess it up. Okay, so I have to make sure to keep the angle up slightly. But other than that, I think I'm free to weld it. Okay, I think that should be good. I'm gonna go check that and then I'll weld it up. It's all good. Alright, so that's pretty dynamite. I'm gonna go ahead and get this guy welded up. Now that I clearanced the inner metal dash structure, I'm clearancing the plastic that was interfering with the column as well. Cool, that fits really good.
It's not perfect, but it gives it that support across this gap, and it gives us all that clearance back.
Okay, so for my steering shaft, this guy right here is the stock Starlet steering shaft. It has like a little drip housing on it. So this is the portion of the steering shaft that hooks directly to the steering rack. And I already modified this once, so I'm kind of unmodifying it and remodifying it to fit the new steering column. So first I need to grind off the existing sleeve to expose this part. And I found this is an old jack handle, which I'm going to use for my new sleeve extension, that goes to this guy, which is going to connect to our steering column. So this will be kind of one piece. It's going to need to be a custom length. These are the spines I need to fit to, so or these are the spines I need to fit to. This is really close to this diameter, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grind off the spline slowly until this fits in here. So that I can weld this guy onto this extension shaft. And this guy is actually a little bit too small. You see it kind of loosely fits in there. What I'm going to do for that is I'm going to make cut out a piece of this metal here and form it around this shaft right here. And then it's going to hopefully fit perfectly inside there. So it's extremely close. I think the main thing is there's a weld on this guy. I think that's what's causing this not to fit now. I decided to weld on my sleeve adapter because it kept wanting to slide up the shaft when I tried to press it into the larger shaft.
Alright, so I got this guy tacked up. I'm going to grind that stuff off, the protrusions of the tap.
What I need to do now is I need to move this whole steering setup just vertical. I have to cut out a bunch of stuff underneath here, but make sure not to cut the axis of all my pedals.
right there is pretty good.
Now it's just tacked in, but I finally have a position that I'm really happy about. You know, I didn't show all the cuts here. There was a lot of times that the dash was in and out, you know, grinding, adjusting, making sure everything's centered. You know, this is going to be your main interface with the car. So take your time with this if you're doing something like this, because it's super important and it'll bug you if you get it wrong. Now that I got my column where I want it, I can go back and reinforce weld everything in the column strong. First, I'm just going through the wire wheels so I can get all the surfaces prepped for welding. I think I'm just going to grab my shears and a piece of thicker, I'm not sure what gauge, maybe 20 gauge sheet metal, and just kind of cut out pieces as I go. Okay, so now I got this guy all welded up. I can focus on the connection to the steering rack. So I actually took the exhaust manifold out before I started working on the steering column. If you remember from episode 2 of this build, I mentioned that the exit of the exhaust manifold is right where the steering shaft naturally sits. To rectify this, I'm going to cut off the collector flanges and reroute those into a single collector that goes around the shaft. I actually was able to take into account the fact that I had some interference issues when I was placing my column, so if you're in a similar situation, it might be something to think about. I took this heat shield off. It's right here. Just kind of gives you better access to what's going on here. You know, it might be good to have that in there, but I really honestly just like the look of this, so I think I'm going to run without it. Maybe that's a mistake, but I just think it looks a lot cooler. I can wrap these to kind of shield the heat a little bit, but it looks a lot cooler without that shield in there. So I think I'm gonna do that and grind off these, kind of make all this stuff smooth, grind off that. Just kind of smooth and clean things up. So I unbolted these guys right here. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna cut this bracket off. You can see it's bolted to, I believe, the transmission. It's not perfect, but that's better than nothing. Just cover up my exhaust ports a bit. Here I'm fully removing that bracket that was on the back side of the exhaust manifold. Cool. Now clean it up with a grinder. Alright, let's get back to working on the steering shaft connection. Get a little persuasion for this guy. Well, first I'm going to manually turn the wheels so that they're straight. Okay, that looks pretty straight to me. I know our wheel is in the straight position right now. Okay. So that gives me an idea of where I need to be. Here I'm making the hole for the pass-through a little bit bigger just to accommodate a little bit different position for the steering column. The weld seam on this tube fought me a ton actually, so that was my biggest obstacle to getting all these pieces to fit together properly. Okay, so you have to be able to assemble this, so I'm going to pretend that this joint is not movable. Just kind of put it in here. Sorry for the terrible camera angle, but I'll describe what I'm doing the best I can. Basically, this last shaft that I'm making to custom length, I'm sliding it all the way up on the shaft coming from the steering column. Then I have to make sure that I can easily slide the shaft on the steering rack as well, so I can easily service this in the future. I'm going to take out a little bit of material on this tube. Alright, so that's in. I'm going to make sure the wheel can tilt and there's still that much showing. I made sure that I could tighten the coupler at the firewall. Everything seemed to fit well, so I went ahead and marked my shaft and welded everything all the way up. Alright, now the paint's dry on this guy, I can go ahead and install my steering shaft. Alright, the steering shaft is in. Yeah, I think I'm going to have adequate room. Headers want to point right at this guy, but I think I'll have room to kind of go around that, which is good. At some point I'll have to make some sort of cover for this area. Now that the steering shaft's in place, I'm going to go ahead and start making the exhaust manifold fit. I'm going to clean up the look a bit too. Cool. Alright, so now that I've ground this guy up, eventually I think I'm going to paint this guy white. I think that would look pretty sweet. For now, I'm going to get it fit back up so I can kind of see where I need to make my cuts. Alright, so now I can take these guys off. Yeah, that looks a lot better without all that shielding on there. It's gonna get hotter in here, but looks are have some value. So, all right. So with headers, the main thing is you want to keep equal length runners. So I'm gonna do my best to do that. I mean, I don't think it would be huge if they weren't exactly equal. This is a 2-inch tube, which is very similar to the size here. So I got these 2-inch mandrel U-bends from Advanced Auto Parts online. If you go in the store, you'll get this really kinked, bent shapes, they will work, but I wanted the nice swooping lines for aesthetics, as well as it won't restrict the flow like those kinks will. I think I'm gonna cut just a little right around there, and then we'll see how much longer I need to trim the tail off, but I'll start with right around there and see what it looks like. I think I'm going to cut this guy in half and see if I can spin it, so I'll cut it right about there and see what I can come up with as far as a nice turn. Alright, so as you can see here, I had to make multiple pie cuts, so that's actually 3 different pie cuts on this piece right here. So I got the piece pretty much where I want it, right there. So I was going to weld it on here, but I think what makes more sense right now is to just mark it kind of where I want it to be, and I'm going to tack weld it all up off the car, and then I'll do one more fit up, and then if that works out, I can weld the other down tube off the car. Okay, so I just made one little mark here. I'm going to kind of like take the tape off and tack it as I go. Make sure it's where I want it. Okay, I'm gonna look underneath because I'm liking everything except for I think the angle could be turned down just a hair. Okay, so I put that flange on there. This is my 2.5 inch flange. And I like it, so I'm gonna go for it. I don't think, I mean, I could move it in more or down, or there's lots of ways I could move it, but I think that that's a good location right there, so. So I have to somehow bring something like this. Let's take a fresh piece. I'm gonna want some more bend in it just to kind of get it similar to our other guy as far as length goes. So something more like that. But what I need to do is I need to cut this because I'm gonna have to kind of form it to fit this bigger collector size. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna cut it kind of where I think. Now, it's hard to say where I should start cutting because the other thing I could do is I could kind of don't cut this at all and start kind of making a half moon shape here. So I'm thinking right there would be where I want to cut this guy off. And about here. And then have a pie cut that comes back right there, something like that.
starting to conform to that bigger circle size. Alright, so I decided that I'm going to crack this guy up to kind of give me a better idea of where this is all going to end up. And keep shaping everything, but this will be my kind of gunny principle. I'm also going to put a little more tack on this guy just to make sure it doesn't bend when I'm hammering on it. Alright, so weld the flange on. So I need to hammer this guy into this edge right here. Then I'm going to take this piece here. I'll use this as a pie cut later because this just isn't long enough, unfortunately.
After I finally got a good fit in the collector, it was time to start connecting the dots back to the split on the exhaust manifold.
About as good as you can ask for right there. This guy's definitely a little bit shorter, but I think it's very similar.
In addition to marking the orientation on the pie cuts, I'm also marking the merge point on the two pipes of the collector so that that seam is just a seam. There's no like kind of overlap or inside restriction on the collector itself. Alright, welcome to truth. Nice, I really like that. We're gonna have plenty of room down there. Hopefully you guys can see that. Yeah, it goes right around the steering rack. I guess I'll screw it on and kind of look down from underneath just to make sure I can access the flange really well. Yeah, it's looking good. And then this goes up. Still plenty of room. Yeah, I'm super stoked on that actually. We'll form that the bottom where it moves up to the flange, and my header will be done. Alright, so now I'm just kind of forming the metal to kind of have a nice transition down so that, you know, all the flow will converge properly. I'm just going to get this a little closer to the flange. Once I got pretty close with part of the flange, I decided to weld up that portion so that it wouldn't start to pull away on one side when I hammered on the opposite side. See a nice split in there. Pretty decent transition. So, I think I'm ready to go on this guy. Just gotta weld them all up. So I got this far and I realized that I wouldn't be able to install bolts on one of my flange ears because of the bend in the tube. So I had to grind off the flange and re-tack it in place. After I tacked the flange back in place, I went to go fit it up on the car again because if the fit were bad and I had to grind off a fully welded on flange, that would suck. Luckily the fit was good and I was able to burn everything in for the last time. Last manifold. Pretty exciting. I'm just trying to figure out where exactly I'm going to place the O2 sensor. I'm thinking angled slightly in. This is where the steering is going to be.
Alright, so this is the stock O2 sensor. I kind of pre-broke this loose. I'm probably going to end up getting a new O2 sensor, but I might try it out. Anyway, in any case, I need the bung housing, so I'm just going to cut it out of there.
Alright, so since I have a slight downward angle, I'm going to try to use this pipe to kind of bridge right after my exhaust manifold. And then I'll end up shrinking this because my drop isn't quite as extreme. I'm going to cut it right around there. And then cut it back if I need more or less angle. I should be able to tweak it pretty well.
Let's see how this fits.
Okay, so I cleaned up the ends on these tubes, my O2 sensor section, this section right here, and also I got a 18-inch extension for 2.5-inch pipe. I'm going to weld this guy to the end of here. Then I can this guy's oversized, so I can put a pipe in here and easily weld my up and over the axle. I really like these aluminum spacers because if you use the one that comes with most of these exhaust flanges, they work okay the first time, but then every time you have to take your exhaust apart, you have to get new gaskets. So these ones really aren't that much more expensive. I made that, this guy is made out of one of those toggle clamp deals from Home Depot. I just welded the jaws a little bit wider so I can clamp on things like exhaust, and then I clamp onto the clamp itself. I like that method. Alright, so I got two pretty decent tacks on there just by the feel method. The angle looks pretty good, so I'm just going to wait for it to cool off. Then I can remove it and fully weld that guy in. Alright, so if you look at this guy right here, the transition is pretty bad because I'm using a little bit smaller pipe. This is the stock Alteza, I guess down pipe, you could call it. Sorry about the welder noise, there's a ton of filming no-nos in this episode. Here I'm explaining how I'm going to reinforce the tacks on the exhaust flange where the pipe is touching the flange, And then later I'll come back and form the other part to match up with the edges of the flange. I'm also going to weld the straight section behind the O2 sensor housing so that it's easier to tack weld that assembly in place on the car. Now that should be a relatively easy connection to this guy. I'll have a nice straight shot. I'm going to do some hammering on this guy. Yeah, so I got, on this area here, I'm going to do, like I said, some small cutting. Initially I used an almost used up cutoff wheel and grinder combination, but I really couldn't get inside there. So when I switched over to the reciprocating saw, that worked a lot better. And I actually recommend that for this type of weird job. Oh yeah. I think that's a lot better transition. You can see from the top side a lot closer. Definitely got some gap fill to do, but it's doable. So I retacked up some of those bent edges on the exhaust downpipe, and now I'm going to go ahead and install it so that I can hopefully weld on the extension with the O2 housing, O2 sensor housing. So it's looking tucked pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. I just need to angle up about like that. It should work out okay. Make sure that my pipe is in a good location for the exit. Alright, so I need to mark this so that I know, because the other side is the O2 sensor, I want to angle it up slightly. So I want to make sure that I can see a line that I can weld to. So that's up a bit, but not crazy amount. Alright, so I think that'll be pretty good. Got my O2 sensor up. I can take her out and weld her all up. Alright, so I removed my O2 sensor, I cleaned up these areas, and now I'm just going to burn everything in. Cool. So I can clean this up and put it in the car for the last time until she starts. So the exhaust system is ready for first startup. I'll have the O2 sensor functionality. I think that's a pretty good time to call it. I know this episode was really long, but for me it was really important to tie in the steering column, steering linkage, and the exhaust manifold because they're all so connected in space dependency. The exhaust manifold was by far the most fun part of this project. If you have a vise, a hammer, and some patience, you can do a lot of really cool things with metal. If you guys have any comments, questions, or if I left anything out, feel free to leave it in the comment section. And if you like this video, consider liking and subscribing. It really helps to motivate me to continue pushing out content. Looks like the next episode is going to be on clutch lines, brake lines, and e-brakes. So stay tuned for that. Until next time.